Everyone said she married the old man for his money. No one asked why he was the only one in that house who ever told her the truth. Her husband left her for her stepmother. 3 months later, she walked back into that family as the grandfather's bride, and the whole Choi empire started to shake. Adaize Okonkwo had not set foot in the Choi mansion since the divorce papers were signed. The marble floors, the security cameras disguised as light fixtures, the portraits of dead patriarchs watching from the walls. None of it had changed. Only she had. She stood now in the receiving hall, in white, waiting to marry a man 50 years her senior. Choi Byung-chul was 78, silver-haired, spine straight as a blade despite his age. He had built half the shipping contracts in Busan and buried 2 wives before her. When his grandson Min-jae had left Adaize for Yoon Hairi, a woman barely older than his own daughter, the family had expected Adaize to disappear quietly, the way foreign wives were supposed to. Instead, she had gone to the one person in that house who had never once looked at her like an outsider. "You understand what you're agreeing to," Byung-chul said to her the night before, not as a question. "I understand what I'm taking back," she answered. Something in his eyes, not desire, not pity, something closer to recognition, told her he knew exactly what she meant. Now, as the ceremony began, Min-jae stood in the 3rd row beside Hairi, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. He had not been told until the invitations went out. He had assumed his grandfather was too old, too proud, too traditional to do something this reckless. He had assumed wrong. Hairi leaned toward him, whispering something Adaize couldn't hear. But she saw his face change, not anger, fear. Adaize didn't know yet why the sight of her walking down that aisle had turned her ex-husband pale. She only knew that somewhere in this house, a secret was still buried. And she had just married the one man who could dig it up. The reception ended before midnight. Byung-chul, exhausted, retired early. Their marriage, both of them understood without saying it, was not one of passion, but of alliance. Still, that night, alone in the West Wing that had once been hers as Min-jae's wife, Adaize couldn't sleep. She wandered the halls she used to know by heart and found herself in front of a door she'd never been permitted to open. Even as Min-jae's wife, this room had been off limits. Byung-chul's private study, the one space in the mansion the staff wasn't allowed to clean. The door was unlocked. Inside, files, ledgers, a wall of photographs. And one, tucked behind the frame of a company portrait, Min-jae, younger, standing beside Hairi, not as strangers. Years before he ever met Adaize. Footsteps in the hallway. She barely got the door shut before Min-jae rounded the corner. "You shouldn't be back here," he said, voice low, controlled in the way of a man trying not to sound afraid. "Your grandfather is my husband now. I go where I want. You don't know what you married into. Then tell me." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she almost believed he would. Then Hairi's voice called from the stairs, and whatever had almost surfaced in him sank back down. "Ask him," Min-jae finally said, nodding toward the study door, "why he really wanted you back in this house." Adaize had thought her marriage to Byung-chul was about reclaiming her place. She hadn't considered that she might only be a piece being moved, in a game that started long before she ever met Min-jae. She confronted Byung-chul the next morning, the photograph in her hand. He didn't flinch. He poured his tea, slow and deliberate, before speaking. "Hairi is not who she says she is," he said. "Her father worked for me. Before he died, he stole something that could end this family. Contracts, records, names of men who should never be written down anywhere. I believe his daughter has spent 3 years trying to finish what he started. Marrying my grandson was step 1. And me? You were never part of her plan. That's exactly why I needed you back in this house. She doesn't know what you know. She doesn't know what you saw in Min-jae the day you first came here." He set down the cup. "You notice things, Adaize. That's why I chose you. Not to replace anyone. To watch." "Brr," It should have felt like betrayal, being married for surveillance instead of love. Instead, something steadier settled in her chest. For the first time since the divorce, someone in this family was telling her the truth. "What did I see?" she asked quietly. "That you think matters?" Byung-chul's expression shifted, the first real hesitation she'd seen from him. "You tell me. You were there the night his first wife died." Adai's went still. She had almost forgotten. Min-jae had never spoken of a first wife. No one had. The old man had just told her a truth that answered nothing and opened a door to a secret far older than her marriage, her divorce, or the woman who took her place. Somewhere in this house, a dead wife was still waiting to be accounted for. Adai spent 3 days trying to find a single photograph of the woman Byung-chul had mentioned. There were none. Not in the study, not in the family albums lining the library shelves, not even in the formal portrait gallery where every Choi bride, however brief her marriage, had her place on the wall. It was as if she had been erased. She found the answer, finally, in the last place she expected. The housekeeper, Mrs. An, who had served the family for over 30 years and rarely spoke unless spoken to first. Her name was Seo-yoon, the old woman said, glancing toward the door before continuing, her voice barely above a whisper. Min-jae's first wife, Korean girl, quiet, kind. She died 6 years ago. Car accident, they said. Rainy road, no witnesses. They said? Mrs. An's hands stilled over the tea tray. I only know what I was told to know. That evening, Adizi searched the archived news the way a woman searches for her own reflection in dark water, carefully, afraid of what might look back. She found the article eventually. A single accident report, brief, almost too brief for a family with the Choi name attached to it. No follow-up, no investigation photos. A closed case within a week. Beside the article, buried in the same online archive, was something else. A business registration filed the same year, under Seo-yoon's family name, for a shipping subsidiary that had quietly folded into Choi Holdings 18 months after her death. Adaiz understood then what Byung-chul had meant by watch. Seo-yoon hadn't just been Min-jae's wife. She had owned something the family wanted. She brought the printout to Byung-chul's study that night, and for the first time since the wedding, she saw real alarm cross the old man's face, not because of what she'd found, but because of how quickly she'd found it. You're faster than I expected, he said. Was she killed? He didn't answer directly. Haeri's father handled the accident report. He was head of internal security then, before I fired him for reasons I told no one, not even my grandson. You think he did something to her? I think, Byung-chul said carefully, that Haeri's father discovered what Seo-yoon was about to expose and made sure she never got the chance. And I think his daughter has spent every day since trying to finish claiming what her father started. Through my grandson, through this family, through anything she could marry into. Adaize felt the shape of the whole design settling into place, piece by piece, like a photograph developing in reverse, clearer the longer she stared, and worse. Does Min-jae know? Min-jae, Byung-chul said, has spent 6 years convincing himself it was an accident. Because the alternative means the woman sharing his bed for the last 2 years helped bury the truth about the woman who came before her. That was the moment Adiz realized the fear she'd seen on Min-jae's face at the wedding wasn't about her marrying his grandfather at all. It was about how close she was getting to something he'd spent years refusing to see. She found him alone on the east terrace after dinner, staring out at the dark garden without really seeing it. You knew, she said. Not a question anymore. Not everything, but enough to be afraid of the rest. Min-jae's jaw tightened. For a long moment she thought he'd walk away, the way he always had whenever a conversation edged too close to something real. Instead, he sat down heavily on the stone bench, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked less like the confident heir to a shipping empire and more like a man drowning quietly in a house too large for anyone to hear him. Seo-yoon found records, he said finally. 2 weeks before she died, she told me her father-in-law, my grandfather, was involved in something illegal. Contracts with people who shouldn't exist on paper. I didn't believe her. I told her she was imagining things. His voice cracked slightly. 3 days later, she was dead, and I told myself it had nothing to do with what she said, because the alternative meant I helped bury her by not listening. And Hairi came into my life a year later, charming, understanding, patient with my grief in a way that felt like rescue at the time. He looked at Adaz, and for the first time, something like genuine regret crossed his face. I didn't see the pattern until it was too late. Her father's name in the same files Seo-yoon tried to show me. I told myself it was coincidence. I wanted it to be coincidence. Is that why you left me for her? I left you, Min-jae said quietly, because Hairi made staying feel easier than facing what leaving Seo-yoon's questions unanswered actually cost. You were never the problem, Adaize. You were just the person standing closest when I ran. Adaize absorbed that in silence. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't close to it. But it was, finally, the truth. And after 2 years of marriage built on things left unsaid, the truth felt like standing on solid ground for the first time. Your grandfather married me to watch Hairi, she said. But I think he also married me because he needs someone in this house brave enough to finish what Seo-yoon started. Min-jae's eyes met hers, and in them she saw both fear and something that might have been hope. Then you should know, he said. Hairi isn't finished either. She's been moving money out of the shipping subsidiary for months. Whatever she's planning, it's close Adaize had come into this marriage believing she was reclaiming her place. Now she understood she had stepped into the middle of a war between a dead woman's unfinished truth and a living woman's unfinished revenge. And the money trail Min-jae just handed her meant that war was about to end, one way or another, inside this house. The bank transfers were disguised well. Adaize would give Hairi that much. Small amounts, spread across 6 different shell accounts linked to the shipping subsidiary, each one below the threshold that would trigger an internal audit. But small amounts, repeated for 18 months, added up to something substantial. Enough to buy silence. Enough to buy a new identity somewhere far from Busan. Or enough to buy leverage against the Choi family itself. Adaize brought the pattern to Byung-chul, who studied the printed transaction history with the stillness of a man who had spent 50 years learning not to react visibly to bad news. She's not running, he said finally. She's building a case. Against us. For what? Seo-yoon's death was never properly investigated because I made sure of it. Not to protect myself, but because I discovered too late that Hairi's father acted alone, out of loyalty to me, thinking he was protecting the family. I let the case close because reopening it meant admitting a man died, was silenced, under my roof, for my benefit, without my order, but because of my name. His voice had gone rough. That silence is the one thing Hairi can use to destroy this family in front of every shareholder, every regulator, every reporter in Seoul. She's not trying to marry into power, Adaize said slowly, understanding arriving like cold water. She's building evidence to expose you and take everything the scandal leaves behind. And Min-jae is standing exactly where she needs him, married to her, trusting her, the perfect witness to testify, unknowingly, to everything she needs. That night, Adaize did something she hadn't done since her own divorce. She sought out Hairi directly. She found her in the garden, alone, a glass of wine untouched on the stone table beside her. The posture of a woman waiting for a conversation she already knew was coming. "You're smarter than they think you are," Hairi said without turning around. "I underestimated how quickly you'd put it together." "Your father didn't act alone out of loyalty," Adaize said. "That's the story Byung-chul tells himself to sleep at night. But you don't actually believe that, do you?" Something flickered across Hairi's face, the first crack in 2 years of careful composure. My father died in prison 8 months after Seo Yun. Officially, a heart attack. Officially. She finally turned to face Adai's, and the grief underneath the performance was, for the first time, entirely real. Byung-chul didn't just let my father take the fall for Seo Yun's death. He made sure my father never lived to tell anyone he'd been ordered to do it. Adaisi felt the ground shift again, the story reshaping itself for the 3rd time in a week. You think Byung-chul gave the order? I know he did. I have the transfer records proving payment to the men who staged the accident. Payments made from an account only Byung-chul controlled. I've spent 2 years married to his grandson, waiting for the right moment to make sure the whole family answers for what happened to my father and to Seo Yun together. Why haven't you already? Because the moment I move, they move faster to bury it again. I needed someone inside this house who wasn't loyal to either of them. Hyri's eyes settled on Adai's with unsettling clarity. I didn't expect it to be you, but it could be. Adai's had walked into that garden believing she understood the shape of the danger around her. She left it holding a choice no one in that family had offered her before. The truth from a grieving daughter aimed at the man she'd just married, and no way to know anymore which version of the story was the lie. Adaizi didn't sleep that night. She sat alone in the room that had once belonged to Minjai's mother, 2 folders open in front of her on a lacquered table older than she was, and let the silence of the mansion press in around her the way it always did after midnight. Thick, deliberate, the kind of silence a house learns only after decades of practice. 2 truths lay side by side, and they could not both be right. Byung-chul's version, a loyal man, Hyri's father, acting alone out of devotion to a family that had raised him from nothing, silencing a threat he believed endangered everyone he served, and paying for it with his own conscience, if not his freedom. Hyri's version, an order given, a payment traced, a daughter's father sacrificed twice, once to prison, once to a story built to protect the man who gave the command. Adais had learned enough in 2 years of marriage to Minjai and 2 weeks of marriage to his grandfather to know that in this house, the official story was rarely the whole story, and the whole story was rarely kind. By the time the sky outside her window had turned the color of weak tea, she had her answer, not the one either side wanted. The one the truth actually supported. She spent the early hours before breakfast doing something she suspected no one in the Choi family had done in a generation. She went to Mrs. On's small quarters above the kitchen, sat across from the old woman at her modest table, and asked her gently to finally say out loud what she had spent 6 years carrying in silence. Mrs. On's hands trembled around her teacup. "If I tell you," she said, "I lose my position. Maybe more." "If you don't," Adais said quietly, "you carry it until you die, the way you've carried it every day since. I'm not asking you to destroy this family, Mrs. On. I'm asking you to help me finish something that should have ended 6 years ago." It took nearly an hour. But by the time Adais left that small room above the kitchen, she had a signed statement. The housekeeper's account of a phone call overheard the night Seo Yun died, a voice she recognized instantly because she had served that voice tea every morning for 30 years, saying words she hadn't understood then and had spent 6 years wishing she could forget now. Adais called the meeting for 10 o'clock. Byung-chul, Minjai, and Hyri, together in the study, for the first time since the wedding reception, where none of them had been able to look at each other directly. She was the last to enter, and she closed the door behind her herself. "I'm not choosing a side," she said, before anyone could speak, before the old habits of this family could reassert themselves and turn the room into another negotiation of silence. "I'm ending the game." She placed 2 folders on the desk between them. The first held Hyri's transfer records, the shell accounts, the 18 months of quiet withdrawals, the shape of a woman building a case one careful transaction at a time. The second held what Adais herself had assembled through the night. The banking documents cross-referenced against dates no one had thought to compare before, and Mrs. On's statement, 3 pages, signed in a hand that had shaken with every line. Byung-chul's composure, The same composure that had carried him through 50 years of boardrooms and 2 buried wives finally cracked at the edges. "You had no right to go to my staff." "I had every right," Adeze said, and her voice did not rise, because she had learned in this house that the ones who shouted were always the ones losing control of the story. "You married me into this house to watch. I watched. And what I found, Byung-chul, is that 6 years ago you gave an order that killed one woman and destroyed another family. And you have spent every year since building a monument of silence around it, using your grandson's grief, using his second marriage, and now using mine to keep that monument standing." "I was protecting this family," Byung-chul said, and for the first time since Adeze had known him, his voice sounded like an old man's voice, thin, defensive, reaching for a justification that had worn through from overuse. "Seo-yun was going to hand documents to regulators that would have ended everything I built. Everything Min-jae was supposed to inherit. Seo-yun was going to tell the truth," Adayezi said. "And you decided a woman's life was a fair price for your silence. That's not protection. That's the crime Hae-ri has spent 2 years trying to prove, and you've spent 6 years hiding from." She turned to Hae-ri, whose face had gone very still, very pale, the composed mask she'd worn through 2 years of marriage finally slipping to reveal something rawer underneath. "And you?" Adaz continued, gentler now, because grief, however weaponized, was still grief. "Spent 2 years using a marriage as a blade, instead of using your father's memory as a reason to demand justice honestly. You had proof. You could have gone to the police, to a journalist, to a courtroom. Instead, you married the grandson of the man who destroyed your father, and waited, and let 2 more years of silence pass while you built your case in the dark. Why?" Hae-ri's jaw tightened, and for a moment Adeze thought she would deny it, the way she had denied everything for 2 years with practiced ease. Instead, something in her seemed to finally give way. "Because the police in this city answer to men like him," she said, nodding toward Byung-chul without looking at him. "Because a journalist who tried to run this story 8 months after my father died was fired within a week and hasn't published anything since. Because the only way I ever saw to actually make this family answer for what they did was from inside it, with proof so complete that no one could bury it a second time." Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last words. "My father spent his whole life loyal to this family. He died in a cell believing his silence would protect his daughter. I wasn't going to let that silence be the last thing that mattered about him." "Then let the truth be the thing that matters," Adeze said. "Not the blackmail, not the marriage built on it. The truth, spoken plainly, where everyone can hear it." She looked at Min-jae last, the man who had once been her husband, who had sat through this entire exchange with the particular stillness of someone watching the walls of his life come down around him, and finding, perhaps for the first time, that he didn't want to stop it. "You've known pieces of this for 6 years, Adeze said to him. "Seo-yun told you before she died. You didn't believe her, and then you spent 6 years not asking the questions that would have forced you to admit you should have. That ends today, too." Min-jae was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier than Adeze had ever heard it. "What do you want from me?" "The truth. Publicly. What Seo-yun told you. What you didn't believe. What you've suspected since and been too afraid to confirm. Not to punish you. To finish what 6 years of silence should never have been allowed to start." The study was silent long enough that the ticking of the old clock on Byung-chul's desk became the loudest thing in the room. "You would burn down everything I built," Byung-chul finally said, and it was not quite a question. "No," Adeze answered, meeting his eyes without flinching, the way she had learned to do in this house out of necessity, and now did out of something closer to conviction. "I would make it worth something. There is a difference, Byung-chul, between an empire built on silence and one built on account. I am not interested in running the first kind. As your wife, under the terms of this marriage you arranged so carefully, I have the standing to insist on the second. and I intend to use it." What followed over the next 3 months unfolded with the particular slowness of institutions forced to reckon with what they had spent years avoiding. Byung-chul, facing the combined weight of Mrs. On's statement, Hyri's financial records, and his own grandson's reluctant, finally honest testimony, made the choice that would define the last chapter of his life more than any contract he'd ever signed. He funded a full, independent reopening of Seo-yoon's case, personally, publicly, without the usual armor of lawyers designed to bury inconvenient truths in procedure. Seo-yoon's name was cleared in a courtroom that made national news, not as a woman who died in a tragic accident, but as a woman who had tried, at real cost, to expose something true. Hyri's father was posthumously exonerated, his conviction overturned, his sacrifice finally named for what it had actually been, not the act of a guilty man, but the silence of a loyal one, protecting a family that had never deserved it. Byung-chul stepped down from active leadership of Choi Holdings, the first patriarch in 3 generations to do so voluntarily rather than by death or scandal-forced removal, and in a decision that stunned the shipping industry and made the front page of 3 business papers, installed Ades as acting matriarch over the restructured company. Not out of romance, not even entirely out of guilt, but out of a grudging, hard-earned respect for the one person who had married into his family and chosen truth over legacy when every instinct in that house had been built to do the opposite. Min-jae and Hyri, freed at last from a marriage that had never been built on anything but unspoken leverage and unspoken grief, separated quietly, without scandal, without blame, passed publicly between them. They were, for the first time in years, simply 2 people allowed to mourn what they had actually lost. A father, a first wife, 6 years of silence, without a family's carefully maintained story standing between them and the truth. Adaeze stood, weeks later, on the same terrace where Min-jae had once confessed his fear to her under a dark garden sky, watching the harbor lights of Busan scatter and reform on the water below. She had come into this marriage believing she was reclaiming a place she'd lost. She understood now that she had done something else entirely. She had given a house built on decades of careful silence an ending it could finally live inside, instead of one it had to keep hiding from. But empires this size rarely stay quiet for long. In the weeks after the case reopened, buried deep in the same reopened files that had cleared Seo-yoon's name, one name kept resurfacing in places no one had thought to look yet, a name connected to accounts even Byung-chul claimed not to recognize, and a signature on a document dated only 4 months before Seo-yoon's death. Someone else had known. And someone else, it seemed, was still watching.